Welcome to the first lecture for Art 121, Prehistoric Art. So when we're talking about prehistory, um, one thing you might want to do if you're looking for something to put on the extra credit board is define what history is. So go to that and you'll get an idea of what we're talking about. Maybe it'll start a discussion. So the way that paleontologists and anthropologists look at ancient humans in prehistory is they break it up into three different parts. The first part is the Paleolithic, the second part is the Mesolithic, and then the last part is the Neolithic. So when we're talking about Paleolithic, we mean old stone. So they're talking about old Stone Age. And that is not to say that the people only made things with stone. But when you're talking about very old things, stone tend to last. So most of the things that these people would have made would have been out of other materials that are long gone, but we can kind of trace their development through what they left in stone. So the Paleolithic is from 2.5 million years ago until about 11,000 years before present. In this section only, I'll use before present just because the years are so huge. But when we go on, we'll talk about BCE, which means before a common era. We'll do that a little bit later on. So you may notice that at 2.5 million years ago, this is before Homo sapiens, which is the species we are. So it starts with the lower Paleolithic. So when paleontologists dig up something, basically the deeper that you go in the ground, the lower you are, the more back in time you are. So they call it the lower Paleolithic because when they're digging up these sites, it's at the lowest level. So from 2.5 million years ago until about 300,000 years before present. And what we see during this time, remember this is before Homo sapiens, are pretty simple stone tools and no evidence for symbolic behavior. And when they're talking about symbolic behavior, they mean art, which is going to be what our class is going to be about. And then when we get to the middle Paleolithic, it's right at the beginning of Homo sapiens until 40,000 years before present. And during this time, we start to see, especially from Homo sapiens, more sophisticated work tools, some possible evidence for symbolic behavior. And we see that Homo sapiens had developed about 300,000 years ago in Africa. But despite these people being the same species, there was a big change that made them more like us about 40, 50,000 years ago, and that's called the Upper Paleolithic. And during this, we see, according to White, an explosion of human symbolism. In other words, we see art, cave paintings, grave goods, sculptures, things that are made that seem to have a symbolic meaning and they're not just a practical purpose. During this time, Homo sapiens make their way out of Africa and into Europe. So when we're talking about Mesolithic and Neolithic, it's still called Stone Ages, but it's getting much closer to what we're going to see as we go along in the class. So what the Neolithic means is the advent of agriculture. And this is the most important event in human history. Before the advent of agriculture, all human beings were living in relatively small groups, although they would have connections with larger groups of people. And there was no hierarchical organization. So in other words, you didn't have rulers and you didn't have chiefs, and there wasn't really any ways for people to oppress others. With the Neolithic and the development of farming, after farming for a few thousand years, then we start to see that people, we start to see rulers, people collecting taxes. There's fewer people that have to work to make food. So you have people that are not involved in making food. So we see professional artists. We start to see, professional priests, scholars, things like that. So what the Mesolithic refers to, it's the middle Stone Age, meaning it's a short period of time where there's a transition from being a hunter-gatherer, which means you go and you get your food, by gathering it or hunting it and then moving with game animals sometimes, to agriculture, where you can be more settled and in one place. The years that we have for the Mesolithic, 11,000 to now 9,000 before present, that refers to a very narrow area in what's called the Fertile Crescent. Today, that would be modern day Palestine and Lebanon. And these are the areas where people first started farming. It was a pretty good life there before they started farming, because there was lots of things that grew there, but perhaps environmental changes forced people to figure out more stable ways to be able to get food. So this incredible change in human beings not only created like hierarchy and a lot of the kind of power structures we're going to see, but also enabled people to be able to work full time as artists, which is pretty relevant for this class. So the work of art I'm showing you right now isn't really a work of art. Nobody made this to look like this. It is a water-worn pebble resembling a human face, and it's from about 3 million years ago. So when we look at something like this, it's not made by a Homo sapiens. It's made by what's called an Australopithecus, which is one of the first species who had stood upright. If you've ever seen those pictures where they show human evolution and they show going from like an ape-like figure to a human, and they show them getting more and more upright, that's not how it happened. Our ape-like ancestors were on all fours and then pretty much right away stood up. That was the first thing that they did. But this animal is in some ways more similar to chimpanzees than it is to humans. They have really small brains. But they did stand upright, which enables them to be able to hold things and carry things with them. And this creature was holding this when they died, and it came from an area that was far away from the place that they died. So perhaps they were able to recognize a little bit of something in themselves, and that caused them to carry this around. So perhaps like a early indication of symbolic behavior. So this is the earliest known cave paintings that we have. There's almost certainly in Africa somewhere much earlier cave paintings. But when you look at things that are very ancient, it's serendipitous what comes to us today. Most things will be destroyed through time. So the fact that this is the oldest dated work of art doesn't mean that is, painting, doesn't mean that it's the oldest that was made. It's almost certain that humans made this before. So you can see in this picture, there's actually later works of art. That's these stencils with the hands. The earliest is right here, just this red dot. And you're thinking, well, that's not much of anything. But if you want to make a red dot and make it stick onto the wall, there's many processes that have to go into that. You have to be able to find the pigment, and in this case, it would be red ochre. And then you have to be able to mix it with something so that it's sticky, and you have to mix it with something else so that it'll flow enough that you can put it onto the wall. So the person that did this, even though all they did was make a dot, they intended that dot to stick around and be there for a while. So if you're interested in the science behind it, this particular cave, and again, this is kind of serendipitous, a particular type of calcite had grown over the images. So what you could do is you could date it using uranium thorium dating. It's a very accurate dating system for that. You can go back and pretty far back in time. And because of that, we know that this red dot is at least this old, 38,000 to 35,000 BCE. So it could be older, but we know it's at least that old because something grew over it at that time. So again, this red disc is the oldest cave painting yet found. It's actually old enough to be made by Neanderthals. And if you're not familiar, Neanderthals are the most closely related species to Homo sapiens. Some even consider them to be a subspecies. They have very large brains, and they developed outside of Africa. And if you're European or Asian, you most likely have a little bit of Neanderthal in your DNA, because when Neanderthals encountered Homo sapiens, somebody thought somebody else was attractive. So there is some of that DNA in Europeans and Asians. But Neanderthals, there isn't any clear evidence that they had symbolic behavior. They make clothes, and they were really smart as far as hunting goes, but they didn't seem to be doing the types of things that Homo sapiens were doing. So it's possible this was made by Neanderthals, but we would have to have some other evidence that shows that it was definitively made by Neanderthals. Most likely this was made by Homo sapiens. So in Western Europe, again, during this time, there's kind of like an explosion of symbolic behavior. You see sculptures, and a lot of the sculptures are relatively naturalistic, but some are kind of interesting, like this one, a human with a feline head. You can kind of look at the different qualities of it and try to figure out if it's like some kind of mythical being, or perhaps someone wearing a mask or something like that. If you have ideas about this, again, it would be a good one for the extra credit board. So it's found in a cave in Germany. To make something like this, kind of like the painting I was talking about before, it takes a multi-step process. So this tells you something about how human brains are working at this time. They can see into the future, and they can see multiple steps into the future embedded within each other. So to make something like this, and Kleiner, the author of this, actually learned how to do this himself and realized how difficult it was. It was rubbed with sandstone, cut with a sharp stone, and sized with a stone burin, which is basically a stone that's made into it's thin and long and kind of like sharp, like a pencil. And this would take several days' work. Although Kleiner, for him, it took him a couple of weeks. He thought that someone who had experience with this could probably do it a little bit faster than him. So this might tell you about how humans are thinking. They can perhaps imagine beasts that are part human and part animal. Perhaps they are thinking about how they can gain power from certain types of animals. They definitely didn't eat lions, but perhaps they saw the power of the lion and wanted to have a little bit of that. So these pieces are very interesting. They're called Venuses, not because they have anything to do whatsoever with the Venus from Greek mythology that we'll look at a little bit later on, but just because that's a generic term for ideal woman. We don't really have any way of knowing if these feminine figures, which are this one is similar to many that have been found throughout, are ideal, and I put up the air quotes for that. But they are very interesting as far as what they emphasize. So if you hadn't already put something in the extra credit board, you can look at prehistoric, it's before writing. So we don't know what these things mean. The function and the content is unknown, so we can only sort of guess. Most of the human figures that are made during this time are women, almost all of them. And they're usually nude, but men and women wore clothes at the time. So this is a choice to make these figures nude. So when you see it from the front, one thing you might want to think about, and if you want to take to the extra credit board and do this, you could, is to think about what does the artist emphasize. And it's pretty important with this one that you try not to be shy about talking about what the artist emphasizes, because it's all right there. So be clear, because it can perhaps give you a meaning as far as it could be interpreted. So if you want to do that, pause it right now. And you can make some posts, make some guesses, then start it up again, and I'll tell you like some ideas of what I usually see in other classes. So if you're back, what people usually mention is emphasized is the breasts, the large stomach, the vulva, and what's de-emphasized is you don't see much from the face. And you can see the arms are very short, kind of resting on top of the breasts. So how many students interpret this is they'll often look at it as a fertility type of figure. So this could look like someone who was pregnant, or perhaps someone who had just given birth. Ritual collective healing. Some people mentioned that if a feminine figure at this time is very fleshy and has lots of, kind of a big body, there'd be a certain advantage to that for hunter-gatherers, because hunter-gatherers, sometimes you'll be able to get food you need and sometimes you won't. It would be very unusual to see anyone that is this big or able to put on this much flesh. So most people would be what we would call fit nowadays, meaning thin and lean, just because, for many reasons, because of what they eat and how active they are. But a figure like this could be perhaps one that you could look to during lean times to help people get through, so you don't starve or something like this. The function and content is unknown, but what I think is pretty interesting is I'll usually ask the class, what gender do you think created these? And most people will say that it was created by men. We have lots of evidence to show that that's not the case, that they were in fact made by women. So I think the reason why people sometimes think of this is because they have this idea that men are interested in, just breasts and butts and vulvas and such. But that's probably not the case so much. And what some scholars have speculated, and I'll try to get you a link to it if it's still available, is that this is actually, these are made by pregnant women. Because if you kind of look at the figure from the top, then the proportions don't seem so odd. It's something that you could make if you were pregnant and you were looking down at your body. So these scholars thought perhaps this was made as a way to ensure a good pregnancy. But the evidence they have, I think, is compelling that they're made by women. And there's lots of reason to believe that's so, because when we look at later sculptures, we also have evidence to believe they're made by women. So hopefully the lesson you get from this is don't make assumptions. So now we move on to cave paintings. And this is one of the earliest paintings that shows pictures. This is at Chauvet, and it's at least 30,000 years old. If you look it up, you'll see many different dates, but it seems to be the older dates are more accepted nowadays. It was discovered in 1994, and you can see, I don't know if this is the discoverer in the picture, but just some amateur spelunkers. Those are people who just, explore caves. And in between Spain and France, there happens to be all kinds of great ones. This particular cave had a collapse in it thousands of years ago, which had cut off this particular part of the cave. So as a result, it was kind of sealed off from the outside world. So again, I talked about how it's kind of luck that things last through today. So the fact that this had lasted for so long and that was discovered was luck. So I'll put a link that'll show you some of the animals that are in here, but you can kind of look through and try to identify some of the animals. Most of them aren't in Europe anymore, but many of them are megafauna that they have in other places, like Africa and North America. You might be able to recognize there's some horses, and these horses are very similar to the only wild horse that's still alive today. You can also see rhinoceroses. These would have been woolly rhinoceroses at the time. Some bears and some lions. This figure, the link will identify it, but most people think it's a monkey. I don't think so. And then we also have bison and some wild boars. So what's interesting about these is, first off, it's very realistic. You see it attempts at three-dimensionality. You can imagine the way that this was painted, it's completely dark. So the people that painted it had to bring back candles, and they made their candles out of whale fat. We have some evidence of it on the floor. And it would have been rather dangerous to go back here, because this would have been a place where bears would hibernate. So it would be pretty a lot would go into just getting here. And then on top of that, when you see the light kind of flickering with the pictures, it would almost have like a movie effect. And you can imagine these herds all moving. So what's interesting about the choice of animals is none of these animals are what the people ate. We found people in similar areas and they ate red deer. They didn't eat any of these animals. So next week, we'll kind of like try to explore what that might be all about. And we can try to figure out how it works. So one question, again, if you're looking for something for the extra credit board, is to think about this. Like Homo sapiens existed for 240,000 years before creating art. And physically, they seem to be like us. But they didn't create art. They didn't seem to speak. After 240,000 years ago, they made things that were much more complicated. So the question I ask is, although the Homo sapiens existed before 200,000 years ago, seemed to be physically like us, were they us? Is being a human genetically enough to be called a human? Can we look at a human population and say they don't create something? Are they still human? So what I'm kind of asking with this question is like what it means to be human, and perhaps what is unique about us compared to other animals, even the ones that are closely related to us. So moving on to the Neolithic, and again, the Mesolithic is kind of a transitional period. These years would be different depending on the part of the world that you're in. So in Western Europe, it's not actually this far back, but you know, I'm giving you some pretty good dates. So humans began to cultivate plants and domesticate animals. There was still a reliance on hunting and gathering. It was rarely settled. It was nomadic instead. Although there's new research that showed that some hunter-gatherers in such good areas that they'd be rather settled. And then the Neolithic is fully farming, meaning you're not hunting and gathering anymore. You might be hunting, but you don't rely on that for food. So these dates would be for places in Africa and Asia. It would be later in Europe, about 6,000 to 2,000 BCE. So in other words, 8,000 to 4,000 years ago. And this is when a population becomes full-time agricultural. You have a settled existence, permanent housing. And again, remember, you hardly need anyone to work in making foods, especially if you live in a good area. The people that are farmers might be working 10, 15 hours a week. And most people, half the people wouldn't have to be farmers. So as a result, we see people doing things other than farming full time. And it creates what we think of as civilization nowadays. So out of all the things I could have picked, I'm going to pick Stonehenge because that's probably the best thing to look at. And remember, when we're looking at things like this, most of the things that were made by ancient people would be made out of things other than stone. But because the stone things last, that's kind of what we look at. So there's ways to classify these stones because they're found all over Western Europe. We call these generally megaliths. So it just means literally large stone, a large undressed stone used in the construction of prehistoric monuments. So types of megaliths come from the Celtic language. That's a language that was spoken by probably most people in Europe until a few thousand years ago. And the modern languages that are most like it would be Irish and Welsh and such. So again, these words are Celtic. Menhir would be man meaning stone, here meaning long. So like we looked at previously. And then dolmens would be meaning a table. So I'll show you some examples of what that looks like. And then a cromlech would mean crom and circle, and lech meaning place. So these would be things like Stonehenge. Their homes were made of impermanent material, while these houses of the dead were made from stone. That's what Adam says. We're not sure if all of them are houses of the dead, but there are burials, and I'll kind of talk about that as we go along. So menhirs, a lot of these were made in rows, and we find these in other parts of the world too, in Africa as well. And these are in Brittany, that's the western part of France, and it tends to be a pretty agricultural area, so these things have been survived through time. So menhirs are monoliths that usually stand upright in the ground individually in clusters or in rows. And these rows of menhirs can be pretty huge, like a soccer or football field of stones like this. So some of them you see like this, menhirs have been interpreted as symbolizing the phallic power of the male fertilizing the Mother Earth. So when Adams is talking about that, she means that perhaps this could be symbolic whenever you plant crops. You dig a hole in the ground, you put the seeds in there, and then you cover it up. So with an obvious relationship between between human sexuality, with the eggs inside of women, and then men providing the seed, and then the what you need growing inside. So many cultures that we know of have beliefs like this today. So it's possible that these people had a similar type of belief. So the dolmens are kind of interesting. The earliest dolmens that exist are more complicated, and over time they became less complicated. So chambers are enclosures consisting of 2 or more vertical stones supporting a large single stone as legs support a table. And some of these go into, they're basically making these caves that are pretty interesting with multiple chambers, sometimes having burials inside of them. Obviously, this stone right here is not from the time period, but the rest of it is ancient. So inside of them, we have these very strange perhaps symbols or early form of writing. And these markings, I mean, we don't know what they are. Again, this is prehistoric. The people didn't write. Perhaps they were trying to write here. We don't know what it means, so we can't really say what they were doing these for. But it's kind of intriguing to see this. There was writing that had developed in other parts of the world, but not that we know of in this part of the world. So perhaps it was early development getting towards writing. So the last one is cromlechs, and the most famous is Stonehenge, but there's a bunch of these. It's just Stonehenge happens to be more well preserved. It's a structure where a group of menhirs are arranged to form circles or semicircles. Stonehenge is in ruin now, but there is a pretty good idea through research what it once looked like. So I'll show you some reproductions as we go along. The particular area that this is in, there's a big circle that's around it, and it may have been connected to other cromlechs as well. So Stonehenge had many stages of construction, even before they put up the big famous stones. A ceremonial site long before phase 1 was completed in 3000 BCE, so we have evidence of them flattening out this particular area before 3000 BCE. And then at around that time, they were originally burial mounds surrounded by a ditch about 350 feet in diameter. A mile-long road, so a flattened out area, led out of the circle in the east-west direction. Then 56 pits named Aubrey holes were dug inside the ditch, and wooden posts were placed inside of them. And these pits had bones inside of them. And what is interesting is that the bones came from many different people in the holes when they were dug up later on. And they were tested in 2012. And they looked at DNA, and they found that some of these figures they had parts of bodies in different holes. So how this would have had to have been done, and they would have buried the body or left it out so it could be skeletonized, and then they would take them later on and put them inside of these holes. So perhaps there's some symbolism going on with that. So a large stone called the heel stone was placed outside the ditch in the entrance causeway. This stone marked the summer solstice at sunrise. So that's a convenient thing for an agricultural society to know, is basically to be able to mark seasons. So kind of early calendars and looking at the stars and the sun to be able to figure out what the seasons were are one of the earliest jobs that you see in agricultural societies, because it happens to be important. It can allow you to be more effective agriculturalists. But you may read about on the internet about other alignments with astronomical objects, and other than this stone at the summer solstice, there isn't anything else that we can definitively say is attached to an astronomical object. So be careful of things you may read on the internet about such things. So phase 2 is about 2700 BCE, and they have stakes at the entrance that seem to line up with moon phases, but I've seen other research where they didn't think that was very accurate. It also could just be an entranceway. There could be other meanings behind it. It could be, related to astronomical objects. We just can't tell at this particular time. Then you see later, a couple hundred years later, 4 station stones were placed inside the ring. They may have been used as astronomical markers, again, perhaps to mark seasons so you know when to plant. Giant blue stones that were imported from Wales more than 240 miles away were placed upright to form a horseshoe. So it took a lot of effort to get these stones here, and these people did not have wheeled carts. So how they got these things here is somewhat of a mystery because they're rather huge. So then the couple final stages, the blue stones were removed and replaced with these huge sarsen blocks, which are the ones you see today, quarried about 20 miles away. According to Adams, the stage was built by the Beaker people who had knowledge of metalworking. So apparently the people that built this may not have been the same people that built the earlier stages. They may have just built on something that they found. And then we have the final stages. Smaller blue stones were placed inside the circle, similar to the originals. 2 concentric circles are built around the sarsen circle, perhaps signifying a never completed stage. And perhaps they wanted to connect this with other cromlechs. So Stonehenge is the simplest construction, like we see with the dolmens. It's a post and lintel construction. So that means a post, that's the vertical element, and then the horizontal element is the lintel. But these ones were somewhat more complex because they had mortise, which is on the left, that's kind of the male element, and tenons below. So this may be an indication of how these things were built, because it's actually a mystery without the wheel or pulleys or anything like that, how the people got the stones up on top. So could be evidence for that. So this is something we'll be doing next week. And you don't have to worry about it this week, but if you just want to take a look at it and start thinking about these questions, this will be what the discussion board topic is for the second week of classes. So I hope you enjoyed the first lecture, and I'll be recording the next one pretty soon.